Today is March the 7th, 2003, and we're in the home of James B. Pearl on Northwest Maple Hill Road, 5739. And this is a little bit south of St. Mary's, Kansas. Mr. Pearl was born July the 3rd, 1924 in Rossville, Kansas, so you're like 79 years old now?
Yeah, well, I will be.
You will be
July.
this year, And I'm Dean Schoengert, and I will be interviewing Mr. Pearl today. What were you doing when just before you went into the service?
Well, I graduated from high school in 1942, and I went to work for my grandfather, who lived a mile west of St. Mary's, and he had a 500-acre farm and raised cattle and farmed also. And I worked for him for 2 years, and my brother was 2 years younger than I was, and he was one of us were going to need to go into the service, and so I volunteered to go in the Navy. And unbeknown to me, at the time, he said that he wasn't going to stay home and work on the farm, and he was drafted into the Army. And so it left my father, who was a small farmer, and Grandpa without any young help, and they survived while we were gone. And I went over to Leavenworth, and they were examining for all three branches of service, and they came to me, and they said, "Well, I see you want in the Navy." And I said, "Well, I sure do." And he said, "Well, you're going to have to talk pretty fast." And I said, "Well, I couldn't talk too fast." And he kind of sat back in his chair. He's commander in the Navy, and asked me why I wanted in. And I told him that my father had been in the Navy in World War I. And so he just wrote Navy on. And so there I was. And came home and had a few days and went back and got on a train and headed for Farragut, Idaho, which was outside of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And that was a boot camp up there. And it was, why they ever picked it for a boot camp, I don't know, because the only thing that pertained to the Navy was there was a Coeur d'Alene Lake, was a beautiful, beautiful lake, and later on, after they got my hair cut short and all the shots, and got us in a company, and we were getting toughened up, and I was probably one of the tougher ones in our company, because I'd been working hard on the farm, and whatever paces they put us through, it didn't bother me. I just kind of enjoyed it. And some of them were pretty sore, and they did a lot of complaining. But anyway, we got assigned to be on a firefighting crew, and they were having it was in the fall, and they were having a lot of forest fires. And so we were, we would go out and dig trenches and spend about 24 hours out on the side of the mountain, very little rest, and then they'd bring us back for a day or two, and we'd go back again, and that went on for about 2 or 3 weeks, and we got through that phase, and then I had an option to get on a rowing team, and so we got on with they had the big whale boats over on Lake Coeur d'Alene, and we'd have competitive racing on the weekends. There was some, and you know, it was all so new to me, and it was quite interesting, and I just did what they told me and got along pretty well.
What do you mean by a whale boat?
Well, it was there was about 12 sailors, 6 on each side with the oars, and it was a deep V-shaped boat, and it was made like the old something you'd see in the olden days. You know, it was kind of high on the ends, and you had to step down in it quite a ways, and it took a lot of energy to make it go through the water. But you know, it was good for us because we were doing lots of calisthenics and all kinds of things. And, we had a chief in charge of our company the first 3-4 weeks, and he was too soft on us, and we had a review one Saturday, and the captain that was reviewing all the different companies said that was the sloppiest company he'd ever seen in his life. And then the next Monday morning, we had a young chief that shouted and did everything to scare you to death, and he put us through the paces, and they used to pass around, they call it the Red Rooster. They put it up on your barracks if somebody won that every week. And he said, we're going to have that Red Rooster in front of our barracks. And it took us about 3 or 4 weeks to get it, but we got the Red Rooster. And we learned what discipline really was. And then, but winter was setting in, and the mountains, there weren't real tall mountains around there, but they'd be covered with clouds, and you couldn't see them. And then when the clouds would go away, you'd see snow up towards the top. And every time that happened, when the clouds cleared, well, the snow was down a little closer. One morning we got up, and the snow was down on the parade grounds, and I had caught cold, and we didn't get to go to town or anything, but they were putting on a play there, and the lady needed 2 sailors to go to town to help unload this truck that all the scenery was on, and they picked me for one of them. And I went to the drugstore and bought some aspirin, and came home early, and we didn't have to be home till midnight, and everybody thought I was crazy because I didn't stay out as long as I could, and so I didn't tell anybody I had those aspirin, and I kept taking them, and I was supposed to get out in about a week, and so I nursed that cold along, and got my leave to come home after boot camp. And when I got home, I was really sick, but anyway, that was something I really remembered. Got through my leave and went back to Farragut, and we got our orders, and I was assigned to gunnery school in San Diego, and got on the train in Spokane and went to Seattle and went clear down the coast to San Diego. And it was when we came down out of the mountains around LA, was the first time I'd ever seen the ocean. And I'd been in the Navy since July, and that was probably in October or November. But anyway, we had 6 weeks of gunnery training there, and was sent back to San Francisco, Treasure Island, and stayed there. I was there over Christmas, and we were assigned to go into the post office distribution, and they were sending back packages that had been sent to servicemen, and they were either missing or killed in action, and all these things were needed sorting. There were just rooms of them, and we worked at that until we got orders one day to there was 4 of us, got our names called, and they said to get your gear and be at a certain place, and which I was, and we got on this little, I call it a captain's gig. It was what we call today a fishing boat, but it was all the front of it from where the coxswain steered it and all was filled in as solid. And they told us how we should salute the flag when we went up the gangplank to be assigned to a ship and all. And so that was always a worry, how you going to do that, you know, and carry we had a sea bag and with all our belongings in it, and that was it. And went out in the bay, San Francisco, and here was this ship. It looked like it was a mile up to the top, and this little boat was bouncing around in the waves, and just you know, it was pretty rough. I thought it was anyway, and they couldn't even get up to the gangplank, and here was a rope ladder hanging over the side. Yeah, I could try to figure out how you're going to carry that sea bag up there and salute. And it turned out my worst worry was, how was I going to get up that ladder? They pulled our sea bags up with a rope, and they called it a line then. We could have called a rope out here. And there was 4 of us to get off, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be the first one, and I'm not going to be the last one. Mm-hmm. And so I watched the first 2 go, and so I just crawled up there like I was an old pro at it, and he'd have to gun it to go up there, and then you grab the ladder, and you're on your own then. Well, I got the bottom rung. And so I scrambled up, pulled myself up, and we got right on up there, and that was probably as scary a thing as I was to encounter for quite some time. But we sailed in a couple days from that time and went out under the Golden Gate, and it was about dusk when we crossed under the Golden Gate, and that ship was doing a lot of bouncing up and down, and Ben's we were in the armed guard where we had the merchant marines ran the ship, and we were 14 gunners that sailed on the merchant ship, and so the Merchant Marines fed us. So we had a chow house, a hall where we congregated, and we had access to it, where they had coffee and you could play cards or whatever. So we gathered in there, and I thought the ship was about ready to fall apart or something, and went in there, and everybody seemed to be at peace, and nobody was worried about anything. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to act like a greenhorn, and I just sat in there and acted like I knew what I was doing, and the sailors that I was sailing with didn't figure it out for several weeks that I'd never been aboard a ship. And anyway, we went to Pearl Harbor, and we were, unbeknown at that time, we were standing by to go in on the invasion of Iwo Jima. And we picked up some officers, some naval officers, and one day a full captain came aboard our ship, and we found out that we were going to be a flagship. And the name of our ship was Dashing Wave. And so we gathered a number of ships together, and we went out to the Solomon Islands, and we picked up 1,500 Marines aboard our ship, and there was, I think there was 4 ships in the convoy, plus our escorts. We had 2 destroyer escorts, and we were to go. We stayed in Anchorage there at Saipan waiting for orders to go on in, and that was the first night. We were watching a movie on the deck of the ship, and that was the first night that I had encountered any thing in the air. Sirens went off, and we had an air raid. An alert. The planes never did get in. But I all at once realized that I had arrived in the battle zone, and fear took over, and I was extremely frightened, and then there was something, I guess, peace came over, and I never feared after that. And we sailed on in, and we were supposed to land the troops on D2 of the invasion. They couldn't take Merchant Marine ships in on the first wave of invasion. They had to have, the way I understood it, they had to have beachhead secured before we could bring our ships in. And we were to rendezvous, and this cruiser was going to bring us in, and he was to meet us at 1 o'clock at night in a certain spot, and if he wasn't there, we were to sail around and meet him the next night at 1 o'clock. And he wasn't there the first night, he wasn't there the second night, and finally the third night he was there. And during these nights, while we were just wandering around out there, is what I call it, but there was a hospital ship, and they would come out, and we'd see the lights. They'd sail with their lights on, and of course we didn't have any lights on. And then the next day, the hospital ship would go back in, and when we finally went in, we tied up they had sunken some kind of a big barge of some kind and made a dock out of it. And the hospital ship was on one side and we were on the other side. And we unloaded all of our Marines there, and we stayed there. It seemed like we were there several days, but they would bring the wounded on board the hospital ship, and every morning they would carry the coffins off of the ship. And it was sad, but we left, and we didn't know how bad it really was. And here recently, there was graduates of Topeka High featured in a paper, and they were on Iwo Jima, and I called one of them, and he was one of the Marines that of a very few of his company. I think only 2 of them walked off that island after the battle was over, and I said we were just the delivery boys. We came back to the States, and they had tied up other ships alongside of us in the rough waters while our ship had taken some damage, and we came back and we went up the Columbia River to Portland, Oregon, and that was a beautiful trip going up there, and it was just like being on vacation again. We were clear out of the battle zone and everything, and we stayed there 3 weeks, and they welded on our ship and worked on it, and we lived, we could live in the hotel and they'd pay us for living there, or we could sleep aboard the ship, and we were tied up right downtown. And so there wasn't any heat or anything, but we'd come back and sleep on the ship, so we didn't have to pay for hotel. And went back out, and I'm a little fuzzy about where we picked up these Marines again, but we had another convoy and another, we had 1,500 Marines and another ship with 1,500, and I think we picked them up off Guam is where I think it was. And we were going someplace and we didn't know where, and it wound up we had the flagship, and we went into Okinawa, and that was morning we went in the journey over there. We'd have maneuvers, and they'd have a submarine alert, and the ships had certain maneuvers that they'd go through, and one of these times I saw the periscope of the submarine, and we didn't have any equipment to detect one under our ship, and I think he would get in underneath our ship, and then the destroyers had sonar of some kind. They could pick it up, and they'd pick up one, and then they'd drop ash cans, and we'd go through all this, probably once a day. We'd have an alert, and nothing ever happened. Though. They never tried to sink a ship or anything. Anyway, when we went into Okinawa, they had one of the largest air raids that they'd had up to that date, and a lot of the planes are coming in and diving into ships. And we went in under a cloud cover, and the clouds were so low you couldn't hardly see the mast of the ship. and we got into the main anchorage and had no problems. And I said that we probably wouldn't have ever got in there because I think they knew we were coming, and they probably they couldn't see us. They couldn't. So anyway, we unloaded our Marines, and one of them came back at noon after he'd gone ashore, and he sat down in our mess hall and ordered his dinner just like you'd do in a restaurant, and that's the way we did. We had a choice of 2 or 3 different meals that we could get, and he threw a biscuit and something else on the table. He said, "That was my dinner over there." And he said, "I'm coming to eat the last dinner with you folks." And he did, and we stayed up there in this little cove. There's only 2 ships up there, and that evening, I was on guard and had the earphones on, and one of the fellows on the other side of the ship said, "Boy, that was a big fish that splashed out there." And pretty soon, zing, a bullet went right over the top of our ship, and somebody was shooting at us from up in the mountain, and it was, you could tell it was a large gun, and the captain evidently heard it, and he moved that ship, just drug the anchor. He put it full speed ahead and moved it, and he would have, he would have had us. The third shot would have been on target, and anyway, we got moved, and they pulled the anchor up, and then I remember that night we were so uneasy because there were just 2 of us moving around this little cove up there. We just kept moving all night, and just in a small area. And the next morning, we got orders to go back in and anchor where we had been, and they had gone up in the mountains, and the Japanese had a gun up there on a little railroad track, and they'd roll it back in the cave, and they'd roll it out, and it was a 5-inch gun that they was shooting at. They put him out of commission, and so we stayed there, and when we got our troops all off and everything, they sent us down the coast towards Manila, and we were going down through the China Sea, and we were all on watch, and we could see something on the horizon that we knew it was a ship, and we had a report that there was a Japanese raider in the China Sea, and that they were we were supposed to be on the lookout, but we couldn't tell what it was, and so we thought that's what it was, and they put our ship in full speed, which is only about 22 knots, and it was just a shaking and a vibrating, and we were probably as scared as we'd ever been, and the ship kept getting closer and closer and closer, and finally he got right alongside of us, and he just cut off our bow, and about that time the lights started flashing, the signal lights started flashing. Here's an American ship, and he didn't know who we were, and we never afraid to break radio silence, and so they couldn't identify one another, and so they did it with the light signals. But anyway, I was Manila with probably 1,500 was what we had room for, of soldiers that had been out there for 5 years, and we were bringing them back to the States. And when we were about halfway back to the United States, it would take us 23 days to travel from Manila to San Francisco. Clayton Flood was a lieutenant, and he was a friend of our lawyer here in town. He lived in Hayes, and he came back and would stand guard with us back on the Fandale. And he said something big happened. They dropped some kind of a big something on Japanese soil. And the next day, why, we heard they dropped another one or shortly after. And before, we were 10 days out of away from San Francisco, and we heard that the war was over. And we came on, we were really happy about it all, and we thought we'd probably get to go home. And we came back to the United States, and we docked at Pier 91 and unloaded our soldiers, and 2 days we were back going under the Golden Gate, back out to sea. Nobody said anything about going home or anything, and we found out we were going back to Manila. Well, we knew it was 23 days, and we were about 5 or 6 days out to sea, and we got the word that we didn't have to stand watch on our ship like we'd been doing, and there was 14 of us that would rotate, you know, and we'd be 4 on and 8 off, and or 8 on and 4 off. No, that wasn't right. But whatever our rotation was, we only needed 2 to stand bow watch, and so we had a 2-hour watch twice a day, which was a lot better than what we'd been doing. And so we had lots of time to play cards, and you know, it's just kind of like a enjoyable ride out there. And I always enjoyed being out at sea. It was a lot of days just beautiful. Anyway, we went back and we got another load of troops, and we'd taken some new ones out when we were going out, and we pulled into the dock at 6 o'clock in the evening, and the troops that we had on, we didn't have a full load. They walked off, and during the night they walked on 1,500 more, and we set sail at 6 o'clock the next morning. We were there 12 hours and started back to the United States. We'd always pick up our mail and mail whenever we got into port or someplace, and our letters would go home. And this particular trip, why, a lot of times the folks got letters every, 10 days, 2 weeks at the most. But anyway, we carried our own mail back to the United States. They quit putting it on the airplanes because they were moving the troops, and they needed all the space they could to get them back home. And so anyway, we carried our own mail back, and my mother was quite worried, and all the family, because they hadn't heard from us for 46 days. And so anyway, I called when I got there, and I came home on leave, and I was telling Eileen that I came home on delayed orders to Kansas City, and they paid my ticket, and I reported back in Kansas City in hope that maybe I'd get out. And I got shipped back to San Diego, and got on an aircraft carrier. It was a converted aircraft carrier that was, all the planes were taken off and everything, and they're using it to bring troops home. And we went down to Manila, and no, we went to Guam, and we picked up, I don't know how many, 1,500 or so troops, and brought them back. And I forget where, we came into San Diego, I think, and then they sent us up the coast to, we went up to Bremerton, and then we went and tied up at a dock in Tacoma, Washington. And they said, we're going to put this ship in mothballs, and you're going to have to clean it, we'll seal it all up. And nobody could figure out how in the world they were going to do what they said they wanted to do. And one day, I got word that they were going to send me to St. Louis, and I'd get my discharge. And I'd got acquainted with yeoman and the crew on that ship, and the yeoman said, well, you know, you could probably, if you had a job out here, you could get discharged out here and they'd pay your way back home. And so I had got acquainted with this fella at the filling station, and I'd been working on a dock, helping unload trucks, and so this fellow at the filling station said, well, I'll give you a job. And he says, it might not last very long, but if that'll help you out, Eddie. And so I had told him I'd like to get discharged at Bremerton, Washington, and so they gave me a discharge and gave me a fare to come home. They paid my way home. And so I got discharged, and I went and I never forget, walked across the street, and there was an ice cream store over there, and I got a big banana split. That was how I celebrated. But I bought a ticket to come home, and I stopped Salt Lake City and thought I'd do some sightseeing, and I stayed there one night, and I wanted to get home so bad. I just went and got on a train and started home, and got pretty near to we got to Cheyenne, and the train had been we'd get pushed off on the siding and wasn't making very good time. So I grabbed my pack and got out and started hitchhiking, and got into Denver, and I was going to stay there for a day or two, and that didn't work out, and so I decided to start hitchhiking. And I came out on the streetcar out in Old Colfax and caught a ride and hitchhiked home. And I've been back home, went back to work for my grandpa. He said, you got to come back and work for me. He said, nobody's done anything since you left. And so that's kind of what's my tour duty.
Did you get married after you got home then, or were you married before?
No. I said all the girls that I went to school with and everything got married or moved off, and so I had to start over. And one of the ladies that writes here for our local paper asked if Eileen and I were high school sweethearts, and I said no, she wasn't even in high school. She's about 5.5 years younger than I am. I said she grew up while I was gone. And, she was working in a restaurant, and we went together for about 1.5 years and got married.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pearl.
You're welcome.